The forbidden experiment. The facility was built into the heart of a dead moon, orbiting a dying star. The walls were sterile, the air controlled, but something primal stirred within. Dr. Alan Reese leaned over the console, sweat collecting at the base of his neck. The screen in front of him pulsed with impossible data. It should have failed. It had to fail. And yet Lyra, the alien warrior lying in the containment pod, was changing. Her body convulsed, muscles tightening beneath her iridescent skin. Strange symbols flickered across the medical monitors, flashing between human and alien genetic codes. Her species, the Kypherians, were built to be perfect. No hybridization, no evolution. Their DNA was locked, unchangeable. Yet somehow, Alan's human DNA had fused with hers, and it was waking something ancient. The moment it began, the lab was in chaos. Scientists barked orders. Machines beeped frantically. The glass of Lyra's containment pod trembled as her vitals spiked off the charts. "This isn't possible," Dr. Carolyn muttered. "Human DNA and Cypherian genetics aren't compatible. They should have rejected each other." Alan knew that. He was the one who wrote the research. But now, standing in the middle of the disaster he had helped create, he realized something terrifying. It wasn't just an experiment anymore. It was evolution. Lyra's eyes snapped open. Golden. Sharp. Not hers anymore. For a single second, the world stood still. Then, she moved. Something primal awakened. The containment pod exploded outward. Glass and steel flew across the lab, embedding into walls and equipment. Alan shielded his face as an unnatural roar erupted from the epicenter. The scientists scrambled for cover. The alarms screamed. Lyra stepped forward. The woman who had entered the pod was gone. This was something else. Her frame was taller, denser, her movements fluid like liquid metal. Her once sleek skin shimmered, adapting to the light. Her breathing was deep, controlled, a predator testing its new form. Her gaze locked onto Alan. And then, she spoke. But the voice that came out was layered. Alien. Human. Something else. "You did this to me." Alan's throat went dry. She took a step closer. The security team rushed in. Too late. Lyra turned toward them and moved faster than should have been possible. First scream. Gunfire erupted. Second scream. Someone was lifted off the ground like a ragdoll. Third scream. Cut short. Blood hit the walls. Alan didn't move. Lyra hadn't touched him. She could have. She should have. But she didn't. Instead, she turned toward him, expression unreadable. Alan didn't see a monster. He saw recognition, as if something inside her knew him, as if something inside her needed him. The alarms wailed. Reinforcements were coming. Lyra's new form trembled, flickering between human and Cypherian instincts. Her breathing hitched, her body convulsed. And then she ran. Not in fear, not in pain, but in hunger. A hunger for understanding, or perhaps something else. Cliffhanger. The hunt begins. The facility was going into lockdown. More security teams were deploying. The order was clear. Terminate the experiment. Alan felt a hand grab his shoulder. "Dr. Lin, we need to leave. Now." But Alan wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the security feeds. Lyra had already breached the outer doors. And she wasn't running blindly. She was moving with purpose, straight toward the command center. Straight toward him. The predator awakens. The alarms blared. The facility was in full lockdown. Dr. Alan Reese stood frozen in front of the security monitor, staring at the impossible. Lyra wasn't running away. She was coming straight for him. Her body, once restrained by the limits of her species, now moved with an unnatural precision, as if she was seeing the world in a different way. Surveillance footage showed her weaving through corridors, dodging automated defenses with inhuman reflexes. Every soldier who tried to stop her didn't stand a chance. One swipe of her arm. Bodies hit the walls like weightless dolls. One step. Her speed shattered the sound barriers in enclosed halls. One look. The cameras glitched, unable to fully capture her form. And yet she wasn't mindless. She didn't kill everyone. Only those who stood directly in her way. Alan clenched his fists. She's learning. Lyra was adapting in real time. And worst of all, she was getting faster. Something is calling her. Dr. Reese. Dr. Kara Lynn grabbed Alan's wrist, snapping him back to reality. "We have to leave, now," she yelled. "The facility is lost." But Alan wasn't listening, because he felt it now too. A pull, a sensation in his very bones. As if something inside him was responding to Lyra. As if he could hear her. Not words, not thoughts. Instinct. And that terrified him more than anything else. The final door stands between them. The emergency red lights flickered in the hallway as Alan and Dr. Lynn rushed toward the evacuation chamber. Metal doors slammed shut behind them. The facility's AI was sealing off pathways to contain Lyra. Contain, not kill. The military scientists wanted her alive. Because even they knew this was bigger than an experiment now. Alan and Dr. Lynn rounded the corner and the world slowed. The door to the command center was open. And inside, standing in the middle of the room, waiting, was Lyra. Her form shifted, still struggling between Sci-fian and human evolution. But her eyes, they were locked onto him. Alan couldn't breathe. Not because of fear. Because in that moment, she wasn't hunting him. She was waiting for him. The hunger for more. Dr. Lynn stepped forward, gun shaking in her grip. "Alan, don't." Alan barely heard her. Because he felt it now. The DNA inside Lyra, the one that should have failed to integrate, wasn't rejecting her. It was calling to something buried inside Alan too. What if the experiment wasn't about her evolution? What if it was about his? Lyra took a step closer, her voice low, alien yet human. "You understand it too, don't you?" Alan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. Something deep inside him trembled. The Sci-fians were never meant to evolve. They were never meant to change. But now, neither was he. Cliffhanger. The instinct unleashed. Dr. Lynn screamed. "Alan, move." Lyra lunged. The room exploded in movement. A blur of shifting limbs, enhanced speed. Alan didn't run. He didn't need to. Because somehow his body moved before his mind could process it. He dodged her attack. Perfectly. As if he had always known how. Lyra's eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, Alan saw something else in them. Recognition. Not as prey. As something equal. Something more. And that's when Alan realized the truth. The DNA fusion hadn't just changed Lyra. It had started to change him too. The hunger for more. The moment Alan dodged Lyra's attack, time seemed to stop. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, an invisible tether pulling at them. Lyra's golden, alien eyes widened in shock, not because she had missed, but because Alan had moved like her. He shouldn't have been able to. She stepped back, studying him, her newly evolved senses analyzing every breath, every heartbeat. Alan felt it too, a deep primal sensation crawling through his body. His bones ached, his muscles burned, his vision sharpened. His DNA was changing. The experiment hadn't just altered Lyra. It had awakened something inside Alan too. Something human evolution had buried long ago. The unnatural instinct. Dr. Kara Lynn watched from the corner, her pulse pounding in her ears. "What the hell?" she whispered, gripping the emergency override on her wrist. Her training told her to call in the military strike team. But her instincts told her this was bigger than a failed experiment. Alan and Lyra were no longer separate beings. They were linked, two sides of something never meant to exist together. And then, Lyra spoke. "You feel it now, don't you?" Alan's breath hitched, because she was right. It wasn't just a feeling. It was knowledge. His brain processed movement differently. His body anticipated attacks before they happened. His human DNA wasn't just mutating. It was awakening. A part of him that had been dormant for thousands of years. Something the universe had tried to erase. And Lyra's transformation had triggered it. But the question was, what exactly was waking inside him? The military's secret agenda. A loudspeaker crackled overhead. "Dr. Reese, stand down. We are assuming control of this situation." Alan turned, his mind snapping back to the reality of the facility. The walls vibrated as heavily armed soldiers formed the command center, weapons raised. Red laser sights pinned both him and Lyra. The military had always been watching. They hadn't stopped the experiment, because it was never about failure. It was about testing something they already suspected. Alan wasn't just an accidental participant. He was part of their plan all along. The evolution they feared. General Hayes, the man overseeing the entire project, stepped forward. His face was calm. Too calm. "You two have become quite the anomaly," he said, eyes locked onto Alan. Alan clenched his fists. "You knew," Alan whispered. Hayes nodded. "We suspected, but we never had proof. Until now." Dr. Lin stepped forward, voice shaking. "What proof? What is Alan?" Hayes smiled. "The missing link." A heavy silence fell over the room. Alan's head pounded. His pulse was too fast, too sharp, as if his body was adapting in real time to the danger. Hayes took another step closer. Lyra's evolution wasn't the true breakthrough. He pointed at Alan. "Yours was." Alan froze. Lyra stiffened beside him, her sharp gaze darting between the soldiers and Alan. Something inside Alan was different. More than just genetic change. More than just adaptation. It was as if his body had been waiting for this moment all along. And Hayes knew exactly what he was. Cliffhanger. The truth in his blood. The soldiers cocked their weapons. "Take them both," Hayes ordered. Lyra snarled. Her muscles tensed, her claws extending, ready to fight. But Alan didn't move. He didn't need to. Because for the first time since the experiment started, he understood everything. His DNA wasn't changing into something new. It was remembering something old. Something humanity had forgotten. Something more powerful than any species in the universe. And as his heartbeat slowed, controlled, a final realization hit him. The experiment was never about Sci-fian evolution. It was about human devolution. And what they had just awakened wasn't an experiment. It was extinction. The ultimate betrayal. The silence in the command center was thick, charged with something ancient. Alan could feel it now, pulsing inside his veins, burning at the edge of his consciousness. His DNA wasn't changing. It was awakening. And the military had known all along. Lyra's transformation was an accident. His was the purpose. General Hayes took a step forward, eyes sharp. "You were never just a scientist, Alan. You were the key." Alan's heartbeat slowed. His skin tingled. For the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. He was no longer human, the past that was buried. Lyra tensed beside him, sensing the shift. Her instincts screamed that Alan was no longer the same. Or maybe he had never been. "What are you talking about?" Alan demanded. Hayes smiled. "Tell me, Doctor, why do humans advance so fast? Why did our species outlast others? Why did we become the dominant life form?" Alan's breath hitched. His mind flashed with new sensations. A predator's mind. A hunter's instinct. A species designed not to adapt, but to dominate. Humanity was never supposed to evolve. Because humanity had already been something else before. Something that had to be erased. And now, Alan had unlocked it again. Lyra seized the truth. Lyra's golden eyes narrowed. Her body was still adapting, still learning what it meant to be something new. But Alan Alan wasn't becoming something new. He was becoming something old. Something her species had once feared. Her chest tightened. What had they awoken? And worse, had she been the one to set it free? Her claws twitched. For the first time, she wasn't sure if Alan was an ally or something she had to kill. The military's plan revealed. General Hayes wasn't afraid, because he had been preparing for this moment. Alan wasn't the first. The government had found traces of this hidden, dormant code buried inside human DNA long ago. A code that pointed to something terrifying. Before civilization, before history, there was something else, something inhuman, and Alan Reese was now its first rebirth. You see it now, don't you? Hayes said, stepping closer. The experiment was never about Lyra. She was the spark. He looked directly at Alan. But you are the fire. Alan felt his pulse shift. His breath slowed. His muscles tightened in a way they shouldn't. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own existence, like something else inside him was looking out through his eyes, like something else had been waiting for this moment all along. The first kill. The soldiers raised their weapons. Alan Reese, you are coming with us, Hayes ordered. Alan didn't move. His mind was splitting apart. Two forces inside him. One that wanted to run, and one that wanted to hunt. Lyra's breath hitched. She could feel it too. The thing inside Alan wasn't going to let them take him. And then, Alan moved, faster than humanly possible. 1 second, he was standing still. The next, a soldier's throat was ripped open. Blood splattered against the walls. Alan's own hands twitched. He hadn't even thought about doing it. His body had acted on its own. His instinct had taken over. And as he stood there, gasping, the realization hit him like a truck. He was becoming something else. And the worst part, it felt right. Lyra staggered back, her hands clenched into fists. She had to make a choice. Stand with Alan, or kill him before it was too late. Alan's glowing, inhuman eyes snapped toward her. His lips curled. I remember now. The war for evolution. The body hit the floor with a wet thud. The room was silent. Alan hadn't meant to kill him. He had just moved, faster than thought, faster than reason. His body had acted before his mind could stop it. And now, a dead soldier lay at his feet. His fingers twitched. There was blood on his hands. His breath came too easily. His heart steady, too steady. This wasn't panic. This was instinct. A part of him enjoyed the kill. A part of him wanted more. The divide between them. Lyra stood a few steps away, watching him carefully. Her golden eyes were sharp, calculating. Her own transformation had been a nightmare, a forced adaptation. But Alan's? Alan wasn't adapting. He was becoming. She could feel it now. A pull in the air. A silent command. Predator to predator. And the terrifying part. For the first time, Lyra wasn't sure if she was still the strongest one in the room. The military's hidden truth. A slow, mocking clap echoed in the room. General Hayes. Well, he said, stepping over the dead soldier's body, completely unfazed. Looks like we found our answer. Alan's fingers twitched. His muscles were still burning from the unnatural movement. Answer to what? Alan growled. His voice was off, rougher, deeper, like something else was speaking with him. Hayes smirked. To whether or not we could wake it up. Alan's mind split apart. He saw flashes, things he had never experienced. A burning sky, a world drowned in war. Creatures like him, but bigger, more monstrous, more complete. And then he saw it. A Sci-Fian army kneeling before something. Not an alien, not a god, but a human, or at least something that looked human. And the realization struck him like a blade to the chest. The Sci-Fians didn't create him. They feared him. They had always feared what humans really were, because humans weren't the weaker species. They were the monsters. And a long time ago, they had ruled everything. Lyra's breaking point. Lyra staggered backward. The vision had hit her too. For centuries, her people had believed themselves to be the apex race. But if these memories were true, they weren't the strongest. They were the survivors. Survivors of something far worse. Alan's kind. She looked at him, really looked at him. The way he moved, the way his body adjusted so effortlessly, the way his very presence was affecting her own biology. She clenched her jaw. "Alan," she said carefully, voice low. "We need to leave." Hayes chuckled. "It's too late for that, sweetheart." He raised his wrist, clicking a device. Alarms blared. Steel panels in the walls slid open, revealing holding cells stacked with others. Other experiments. Other humans. And every single one of them had Alan's eyes. The army that never died. The room shook as something massive awoke. The experiments lifted their heads. Some were fully human, others were partially transformed. Their bodies hadn't finished evolving yet. But Alan was the first to complete the change. And that's when Hayes grinned. "We never planned to stop you, Alan," he said. "We planned to wake you up." Alan staggered. He had never been the first experiment. He had been the final step, the trigger. And now, the last remnants of the original human species were waking up, not as scientists, not as victims, as an army. The war begins. Lyra's claws extended. She didn't care what the truth was. She knew a trap when she saw one. "We have to go. Now." But Alan couldn't move, because deep inside, something inside him was screaming. A hunger, a command, a feeling he didn't want to admit felt right. Lead them. Take back what was ours. His heartbeat matched the others in the room. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he was becoming. He was afraid that he wanted it. The truth buried in blood. The walls trembled. The air inside the facility grew thick, charged with something ancient. Alan felt it, not in his body, but in his blood. The pulse, the rhythm, the command. Across the room, the others were waking up. The forgotten humans, the ones who had never fully died out. Their eyes glowed, their bodies shifting, their instincts synchronizing with his. And Alan realized something terrifying. They weren't just waking up. They were waiting. For him. Lyra's choice. Lyra's breath was sharp, controlled. Her muscles tensed, ready to attack. She had been born a predator, built for war, a warrior species. And yet, standing here, watching Alan and his kind awaken. For the first time in her life, she felt like prey. Alan turned toward her. His face was still his. But his eyes weren't. They were something older. Something not human. "Alan," she growled. "Don't do this." His fingers twitched. His breathing had changed. Slower, measured, more efficient. His instincts screamed at him to answer the call. To take his place as their leader. To become what he was meant to be. And the scariest part, it felt right. The last lie exposed. General Hayes wasn't smiling anymore. He had expected Alan to lose himself, to let the primal hunger take over. But Alan was still thinking, still fighting. And that meant Hayes had made a mistake. Because Alan wasn't just an experiment. He was something unpredictable. And now he was remembering too much. Alan's voice was rough, heavy. "Tell me, why did you bury us?" Hayes exhaled slowly. "Because you were never supposed to come back." Alan's hands clenched. "We were erased." Hayes nodded. "A long time ago, your kind ruled. But you weren't conquerors. You weren't kings. You were extinction itself." The words settled into the air like poison. Hayes continued, stepping forward carefully. "Humans weren't born weak. They weren't meant to evolve. They were the apex, the unstoppable, the universe's first and last mistake, the unfinished war." Alan's memories flashed again. The burning sky, the kneeling armies, the last of the old Sci-fireans standing before a human god. No, not a god. A destroyer. His kind hadn't ruled the galaxy. They had erased the ones who did. His breath hitched. That's why humans were weaker now. That's why their evolution had been suppressed. Because they had been rewritten. Their own DNA had been locked, caged, broken. A genetic prison. And now, that prison was broken. Because of him. Because of Lyra. She was never the experiment. She was the key. And Alan had been the door. The monster awakens. Lyra saw the change first. Alan's breathing stopped. Not out of fear. Because his body didn't need it anymore. The other experiments washed him. Still waiting for his command. And in that moment, Alan had to make a choice. Embrace what he was. Or fight against it. Lyra's claws flexed. If you give in to this, I'll have to stop you. Alan's lips parted, not in a smile. In something deeper. Something primal. And his voice, his true voice, echoed through the room. Try. The facility exploded into chaos. The final transformation. The facility shook. Screams. Gunfire. Bodies hitting the floor. It had begun. The forgotten humans, Helen's kind, were waking up. Their breathing sensed. Their instincts sharpened. Their hunger returned. And at the center of it all, Alan stood motionless, his body caught between two choices. Give in or fight back. But what if there was no choice? What if the thing inside him was never meant to be caged? What if this was who he truly was? The breaking point. Lyra moved first. She lunged, a blur of speed and strength. Her claws aimed straight for Alan's throat, because she knew, if he surrendered to this, nothing could stop him. Not the military, not the Sci-fireans, not even her. But the moment her strike landed, Alan wasn't there anymore. Not that he dodged. He had already moved before she did. His body saw the attack before it happened. And now he was behind her. Faster, stronger, something else entirely. I'm not human anymore. His voice wasn't his. It was layered, like 1,000 forgotten voices speaking at once. Lyra turned, but she wasn't fast enough. Alan's hand clamped around her wrist. For the first time, she felt fear, because he hadn't just stopped her. He was studying her, learning, adapting. And worst of all, he wasn't hurting her. He was letting her go, because he didn't see her as prey. He saw her as something else. Something. His. The military's last weapon. Across the facility, General Hayes was losing control. The forgotten were spreading. Unstoppable. Unreadable. They weren't supposed to wake up like this, the scientist stammered. He's controlling them. Hayes clenched his jaw. No, he's doing something worse. The scientist swallowed. What? Hayes's face darkened. He's choosing who survives. Alan wasn't leading the forgotten like an army. He was sorting them, separating the strong from the weak, deciding who would evolve and who would be erased, just like his kind had done before. Deploy it, Hayes ordered. The scientist paled. But sir, it's not stable. Deploy it. The floor split open. The final confrontation. The ground shattered beneath them. Alan and the hybrid collided, the sheer force of their battle warping the air. Each strike reshaped the battlefield. Each movement rewrote evolution itself. The soldiers watching from the distance knew the truth now. This wasn't a fight for survival. This was a fight to decide which species had the right to exist. Lyra, bleeding, broken, watched in horror. Because she finally understood. Alan was never meant to be human. He was never meant to evolve. He was meant to return. And as the hybrid screamed in defiance, Alan's eyes burned with something older than time. A whisper echoed through the air. Not in English. Not in any alien tongue. A command from the past. A command that ended civilizations. Alan spoke it, and the war ended before it even began. Final lines. The last evolution. The facility was gone. The sky above split apart. The universe itself recognized what had returned. Lyra lay on the ground, gasping for breath. She turned her head, and in the dust, in the silence of the dead battlefield, Alan stood alone. Not human, not a monster. Something beyond both. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, she knew one terrifying truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Alan had won, and now the universe belonged to him. The end.